So we've had a bit of politics, we've had a bit of the media. We're now going to be introduced to the deep and dark world of, perhaps that's unkind. We're going to be introduced to the world of policies behind all of that. We're very honoured to have Dr. Shubho Banerjee introducing this topic for us. He took up his position as Deputy Secretary in the Department of Industry in September last year. He's responsible for the industry, economics and energy efficiency functions of the department. Shubho's also worked as a management consultant in the private sector and for an Indigenous policy think tank. On top of that, Shubho is a scientist with a BSc and a PhD in physics from the Australian National University. He's also completed master's studies in environmental policy and economic and social history at the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. So that's a fair bit of background to be leading into the policy arena. I'm going to hand you over to Shubho, who will take us through policy.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks for that introduction. And I should note, and this is our fault in terms of the introductions, I do now look after science policy in the department as well. So, as well as a personal interest, I've got a professional interest in the matters that we're discussing today. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you all today. Really pleased to be with you. As Ross mentioned, my initial academic background was in physics. So I was a physics grad student. I did a BSc and a PhD across the road here at the ANU. And when I made the move into public policy, it was absolutely with the sense that I was interested in how science could contribute more to the public policy debate. That was absolutely the driving factor in thinking about making the move over. And so I think Science Meets Parliament is a terrific initiative. I think it does provide a fantastic opportunity for a mixing of the two worlds. I do think that they are still two worlds. And I guess it's my pleasure today to give you a little bit of a tour of the policy side of things. And we've titled the talk today, A Guided Tour Through the Policy Factory, to give you a bit of an overview. So before we start, as for any guided tour, of course, the first thing I need to do is check that you've got the right ticket. And I was just talking to Katrina just before I got up to speak, and Katrina tells me that it is incredibly difficult to get a ticket to come to Science Meets Parliament. You're a very select group. It's a very premium group. And of course that takes me to another premium group that made me think in preparation for my talk that perhaps there might be an analogy here that might be useful for you. Now, it strikes me that there are actually some really interesting analogies between Willy Wonka's chocolate factory and the policy factory that I'm going to tell you about today. As you can see, for Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, the ticket said, "Greetings to you, the lucky finder of this golden ticket from Mr. Willy Wonka. In your wildest dreams, you cannot imagine the marvellous surprises that await you." Your ticket today similarly will allow you to look around the amazing place that is the policy factory. I'll show you some of the ways that policy is put together and where science fits into this process. I'll introduce you to some of the product, policy, and talk a little bit about how it's made, what the processes are. And you'll see that there are actually some lovely parallels between Willy Wonka's famous chocolate factory and our policy factory here. Like Willy Wonka's factory, policy making is a creation. A range of different ingredients get added and assimilated to create a product that's ultimately for the public. Like Willy Wonka's confectionery, policy making is a bespoke process. Policies are fit for purpose. They're constructs in response to a particular demand as we go. And yes, like the famous Oompa Loompas, public servants tend to be hardworking, conscientious, dedicated, adventurous and slightly mischievous. And they are not above the occasional stretched analogy, as you'll see today. So let's use this golden ticket and begin our journey through the policy factory. Now, those of you that are familiar with the book would know that part of what's amazing about the factory is at the start of the book, no one knows what's in it. Like there's this enormous divide, I guess, between people outside who love the products and any understanding of what's actually going on inside, any understanding whatsoever of the process through which these amazing products are being produced. The quote we've used here is, "And what a tremendous, marvellous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it, a high wall surrounding it, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it." And I think for those of you that aren't from Canberra, perhaps this might be a bit of a reflection of Canberra, this sense that there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of noise, there are strange whizzing sounds, I think, but no one really knows exactly what's going on inside. Policy making is, in one sense, just like a factory. Its cogs, its machines, its ingredients and its people all work together to produce a product ultimately for the public. In our policy factory, these cogs, these ingredients are cabinet submissions, budget processes, ministerial briefs, informal advice, consultations and secretariat support for various groups. The list isn't exhaustive, but all these components work together to help us as public servants to deliver the agenda of the government of the day, and through that to make a contribution to improving Australian life. In the policy factory, our portfolio ministers set the agenda. It's then up to us to translate that into action. Along the way, ministers make decisions and we act on those. That's the Westminster system within which we work. And so within this system, once the decision is in place, we make policy to support it. So let's go inside. What we're going to try and do to start with is really trying to understand, what do we mean by policy? What is the essence of policy? What's the point of what we're trying to do? What is policy? Now, in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, of course, by definition, chocolate is at the heart of everything. The waterfall is most important, Mr. Wonka went on. It mixes the chocolate, it churns it up, it pounds it, it beats it, it makes it light and frothy. It's the only way to do it properly, the only way. And when we were thinking about the talk, we thought, well, what is the essence of policy? And I think the essence of policy are ideas. Much like Wonka's constituent chocolate, every time we're thinking about a policy, we're thinking about, well, what is the idea at the heart of this? And what we need to do with that idea is muck around with it, beat it, test it, push it, pull it, mix it up, froth it up. Think about exactly what it is that we mean by it and how it works and how it might be used to develop the policy that we're talking about. The point of policy products, of course, is to assist the government to achieve its objectives on behalf of the citizens of the nation. Policies are often enacted in response to immediate or future problems. And sometimes policies are enacted to exploit particular opportunities or potential opportunities. Policies are bespoke. It's really important to keep in mind that although we're talking about a factory, although we'll talk about some common practices for producing policy, each policy product is bespoke. We think about each one in a particular way. We think about what the need is. We think about what it is that we're trying to do. One size does not fit all in the policy world, nor could it. Each policy has its own dynamic, its own momentum, and its own objectives. And while they are bespoke, as I mentioned, there is a high degree of underlying consistency in the process through which they're produced in the policy factory. And I think the point of this talk, and the point of the invitation from Katrina in the first place, was to explain a little bit more about what that process looked like. What are the uniform elements, what are the consistent elements that underlie pretty much any policy process? And so how can you as scientists get involved? So let's explore that policy production process in a bit more detail. The policy literature converges around 5 key points in the policy process. This is a simplification, but as I say, it's a simplified model, which of course you're all familiar with, and it's meant to set out the uniform or consistent elements. The 5 elements that I'll focus on, and there's a slide about this in a minute, the 5 elements I'll focus on are anticipation. Anticipation is about identifying the problem and setting the agenda. Here we're really looking to establish the policy question. Last week I was up at the Australian Institute of Marine Science in Townsville. I was talking to some of the scientists there. They were talking about how much care they take to establish the research question. Really an enormous amount of work is to think about what exactly are we asking here, so that we can think about exactly the right approach, exactly the right observations, exactly the right experiment to try and establish it. In my public policy experience, we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about the question with the degree of precision that we should. It's one of my real passions, and I think it is a passion that's actually established from my physics background. Unless you think about the question really carefully, then you're not going to be serious about really addressing the problem that you have. And more than that, if you think about the question really carefully, then often the answer will more or less fall out. From my maths days, I guess, the idea of thinking about the framing in exactly the right way, thinking really hard about the concept. What is the idea? Where are we getting to? And then my maths friends would say, well, yeah, now that I know that, I know an answer exists, and then they move on. That kind of sense of what exactly is the problem is incredibly important. The next stage is formulation. That's where we're looking at designing policy options. Here we're gathering information and analysing it. Then we go to consultation, where we test the policy options. We're looking at the feasibility of any proposed policy responses. We're talking, we're testing, we're trying to figure out how things might actually work. Then there's adoption, implementing the policy. Here you're looking to actually get it done. Get out into the real world, see what the effects are, make sure it's working in the way that you want it. And evaluation. Of course, good practice, good policy practice, good scientific practice involves evaluation, assessing the effectiveness of the policy and its impact. Now, I mentioned before that all of this, the dry language around the policy process, is a way of setting out consistent elements of any policy process. But what's going through the machine are the ideas that we're thinking about. We're testing, we're thinking, we're designing, we're shaping. It's all around ideas, a bit like Willy Wonka's chocolate. So how does science fit into this process? Well, the quote we've got from Willy Wonka for science is, people that are familiar with the book would know that it's where he's into the room where he's demonstrating the first ever chocolate TV. And he says, well, why can't I send a real bar of chocolate whizzing through the air in tiny pieces, then put the pieces together at the other end, all ready to be eaten? Impossible, says Mike TV. And, of course, we know in the book that it is possible, it's just got a few complications. Science, I think, sets the bounds, and sometimes definitively, of what is possible and what is impossible. Science has a special status in policymaking. That's one of the reasons why we spend a lot of time thinking about the science-policy interface. There is something special about science. There's something particular about science. It has an authority with truth, and that gives it its privileged place in its capacity to inform different stages of the policy process. Science can and does frame the question from which a policy response might flow. Science can and does provide us with crucial information to understand the implications of proposed policy responses. And science can and does create a framework through which we can assess the value and the success of a policy. However, science doesn't have exclusivity. We all know this. Its contribution to policy is not all-consuming. It does not make policy directly. It's part of a confluence of what are often competing priorities that all have to be considered and accommodated. Need to think about community views, need to think about political capital, we need to think about financial expenditure, amongst other things. These are all balanced and weighed against each other through democracy, in our system by ministers who are then accountable to the Parliament and to the nation. So let's track how science can connect in the policy cycle that I was telling you about before. So I'm going to use an example, and I'm going to use it quite quickly, and I'm going to use it with a caveat that I'm not a deep subject matter expert in the example. I'm using it to show you how it might connect together rather than trying to make any particular substantive point. And the example I'm going to use is early childhood learning. Now, the first phase that I talked about in the policy cycle is anticipation. And I think in early childhood learning, it is striking that within the last, let's call it 20 years, between 10 to 20 years, there has been a fundamental shift in science, in policy, that is significantly driven by fundamental science, fundamental neuroscience, fundamental behavioural science, in how kids learn, in the importance of those early connections in their brain and what is going on and the role of environment and the role of different drivers in learning. I think it is really amazing when you think about the state of policy in early childhood learning, let's say 20, 25 years ago versus now. You can absolutely clearly see the imprint of fundamental science in the kinds of policy questions that we're trying to answer. Then I talked about formulation. I think there's also no doubt that that an increased understanding of fundamental neuroscience and behavioural science has made a big difference in thinking about policy design around early childhood learning. That's the sorts of environments for good early childhood learning, the sorts of health interventions that are required for healthy early brain development. Now, in thinking about exactly how that will be put in place, there was enormous consultation. I mean, this is over many, many different policy processes. Enormous consultation with the medical community, with the educational community, with service providers, and then that's the kind of first order interface, if you like, of science and policy. Then, of course, you're into a second order as well. How are we actually going to get this done? And there's a lot of consultation in that as well. Talking to potential providers of the workforce, talking to universities, talking to schools, talking to early childhood centres. All of this then is about thinking about different options which have different risks, different costs and different impacts. And then there's evaluation. Now, evaluation, I think, from the Commonwealth point of view, is an area that's been getting particularly increased attention, as it should, in terms of trying to think about how this might work. I'm not familiar with specific evaluations in the early childhood space. I've seen a couple of studies that are broadly about different types of policy interventions, but you would all know that there's more and more interest in randomised trials, thinking about different forms of systematic evaluation for different policy instruments. Now, as I say, my point in providing that example is not to go through the example per se, but to show you that science interacts in different ways in different parts of that cycle, and that there's a different kind of characteristic. And through that example, obviously, I've been using it in a kind of simplified form. In the real world, it's much more complicated, it's much messier than that. So to go back to our chocolate factory, if we think about how it works in practice, this is one of my favourite quotes from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And it's all about Willy Wonka when he's showing the room in which he does his inventing. And he says, the narrator says, all about him, black metal pots were boiling and bubbling on huge stoves, and kettles were hissing and pans were sizzling. Strange iron machines were clanking and spluttering, and there were pipes running all over the ceiling and the walls, and the whole place was filled with smoke and steam and delicious rich smells. This is the heart of the policy process. This is exactly what it looks like. You're thinking about different things, often in parallel. I'm in the midst of probably 3 or 4 different substantive policy streams at the moment that are all just testing and pulling and thinking, how do we go about this exactly the right way? There is an enormous amount of inventiveness in this. There is an enormous amount of creativity. There's an enormous amount of dexterity to think about how you do all of these things all at the same time. And I think it's important for you, as scientists in interacting with the policy process, to realise that that is the messy reality. That is what it looks like when you come and talk to a public servant who's trying to balance all these different things. These are different policy processes. I've made the point that within a particular policy process, it's also very messy. The different steps that I've talked about kind of all run into each other. There's no neatness, there's no clean kind of separation between the sorts of things that I've been talking about. That's because policymaking is rarely a linear procession or a chronological sequence. It can't be. There are so many different feedback loops. There's a lot of fiddling and testing, analysing and tasting, and it's a lot more frenetic. Ultimately, policy aims to provide the best possible answer to a problem using all the tools that are available to it at that point in time. So for science to be an effective part of policy, it has to be an ongoing dialogue. There needs to be continuing participation and engagement on both sides. Hopefully what you're getting from this presentation is it's helpful to understand the model, it's helpful to understand different stages. In practice, we're all working across different parts of this different cycle at the same time. And so when you're talking to someone who's in a policy making role or a policy advising role, you need to understand where in the process are we? How can my input be useful? When might it be the most effective time to engage? And to do that, you need to have a level of trust. You need to have some sort of relationship to know how that might all be put together. Now, often policy processes take a long time. They take many months, sometimes years, from anticipation through to evaluation. But the process is finite. We're always looking to get to an end point. Policy is embodied in a product, and it's for use. Policy is for implementation. But there's a further consideration, a further complication that is really crucial to keep in mind, and that is many high-profile policy processes have times when they move very quickly indeed. It was mentioned in my introduction, I've spent time in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. That's really characterised by issues that become very big very, very quickly. And at that time, you have to move. You have to move. Community views might have changed, new science has emerged, a particular external event like a global financial crisis might have occurred, government priorities might have changed. At those times, policy moves very, very quickly, and scientific input must be tailored to be sympathetic to that time frame, to be of any use whatsoever. I go back to my interest in the question. The question must be answered to the best of available knowledge with reasonable caveats, but it must be answered because a decision needs to be made. It's no use whatsoever to equivocate at these times. To wish somehow that you were being asked a different question. Look, that's a really hard question. I've been thinking about this other thing. Can I tell you about this other thing? That's hopeless. That's absolutely hopeless. You need to think about what is it exactly that I can say on the basis of what I know, and what are some reasonable caveats on the basis of what I currently know. That's input that is actually useful for a policy process at those sorts of times. Policy processes are ultimately about the exercise of judgment on the basis of the best available evidence and analysis. That's my job. Judgments on the basis of best available evidence and analysis, packaged up for decision, that then ministers form their views about exactly how they think the balance of evidence lies and the balance of interest lies. So that's pretty much the end of the tour for today. If you're interested in learning more, I'd certainly encourage you to go out and try and find out a bit more. There's not an enormous amount written about the messy practical reality of this stuff. I was talking to a friend and an ex-colleague who's at Griffith University nowadays, and she was bemoaning the lack of codification of practice. There are a couple of sources that might be of assistance that in fact the Department of Industry has been involved in. One is a project that was done on the place of science and policy development in the public service in 2012, which was actually launched by a colleague of mine, Patricia Kelly, at this forum a couple of years ago, which you can get on the web. The other thing that's up there is something from the Coombs Policy Forum from the ANU across the road, which also helps to map Australian government investments in institutions. But my main message is this: if you're interested, look for other opportunities, talk to people, learn more about the policy process. You're all here, so that's a great start, and use the time that you're here to learn more about it. Establish connections, think about how you can continue that connection. Don't walk away and think, well, at the time someone will ring me. Of course, know your product and its limitations. Be clear about how you want to engage, what role you think you'll have, and at what points in the policy process you can see your science being engaged. And listen. Learn a bit more about the policy process, learn about how a policy maker or a policy advisor might be looking to approach it. While your work might not dictate the policy position of government, it could very well help to shape it. And so that's particularly why I always enjoy the Science Meets Parliament event, and it's always a delight to come and either speak to you or to meet a range of you. In closing, I'll offer up the wisdom of a young boy on the cusp of a new adventure. Please don't be frightened, Charlie said. It's quite safe. We're going to the most wonderful place in the world. Thanks very much.
So we've got time for questions, and I'm sure there must be some for Shubo. So
thanks for that. It was quite fascinating. We've all seen Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, whether it's the Johnny Depp one or the one before that. Depends what generation we are, I suppose. I have a comment as opposed to a question. So you spoke about the policy cycle. So there was anticipation and formulation, consultation, adaptation, evaluation. And then there was, I guess you attempted to cast that in the science lens where the anticipation was a question. There's actually a step before that, and that is principles. So what are the principles that a government might have, for example, or nature might have? So a scientist will go into something saying there is a principle, that is nature doesn't lie. And all of the results and things are reproducible. And so other people can test that, your hypothesis ultimately. So I guess from wearing my scientist cap, what we don't necessarily see is what is the principle that underlies the policies. We just see the rules that come out of the policies which are then applied that we have to abide by. So I think there's a step before that is useful for everyone to understand, and that is what is the principle that underlies the policy development.
Sure, I'll mostly take that as a comment, as you say, but maybe two connected observations. One is, I absolutely think thinking about the principles that will then guide the rest of decision making is incredibly important. I would think about that as part of framing the question. I think it's in a sense thinking about what the parameters of your thinking are, and so to me it's a kind of broader sense of thinking about anticipation, but I'd absolutely agree with you that it's crucial. As to whether or not they're difficult to divine, I'm not sure they are as difficult as all that. I think at a high level, governments in this country spend a lot of time talking about broadly where they're coming from and what they're trying to do. And that is broadly setting out principles. It's setting out this is where we're going to go. The ministers do that in pretty much all their public statements. I think in reality, of course, governing is complicated and messy. And so in that sense, there's always the principles meeting implementation issue. But I think you're absolutely right to say thinking about principles is really important. It absolutely configures, in a sense, how you approach the problem. And so, as I say, I think of it as part of anticipation, but it's certainly a really crucial part of that early stage.
Thank you for that. I'm Ross Thompson from the University of Canberra. I now hope there's chocolate for lunch. I have a colleague who's involved in policy, and one of the things she said recently is that there's phases of this cycle where the government will not be receptive to science, and that's particularly when a policy has largely been written, they're at an implementation phase, they don't want new information. And I hadn't really thought of it in that way before. I think it's a really interesting insight, and I wonder how we find out for ourselves where you are in that cycle, so that we can judge when to time our approaches such that we can be most relevant and most useful.
Yeah, so I think the overall message I'm trying to leave is you need to build better connections. And when I say you need to, I give the equivalent talk to public servants. I say you need to build better connections, and you need to be talking to people in the research community in particular, so that you have enough of an established relationship, enough of a sense of matters of mutual interest that you can talk openly when you need to. Nothing really beats that, I think, and I think personally a real strength of the APS 200 project that I mentioned before is that it talks a lot about connections, community, in that sense, the software of this, rather than institutional design per se. Now, that, because we are talking about different connections, there's no point particularly trying to prescribe it, because it does look different in different fields, it looks different for different issues. But I think if you're interested in policy and you're interested in scientific input to policy, thinking about what those channels are and then spending a bit of time trying to prepare the ground is really time well spent. And as I say, I give absolutely the equivalent message to public servants, that because you never quite know when things are going to go slow, quick, slow, you need to be ready. And so that involves reaching out when things are in the slower phase.